but I'm happy to do that. Welcome to the first talk of the OII term. So it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Murali Shanmugavelan. Murali's academic research focuses on the disavowal of protected categories in media and communication studies and digital cultures, especially caste. Murali's work is a result of his lived experiences of casteism and grounded in his experiences of how information and communication technologies intersect with one of the world's most ancient social hierarchies, the caste system. His postdoctoral research at the OII builds on his academic training and activism to scrutinize re-manifestations of digital inequalities in the gig economy and recommend steps to mitigate them within Fair Work principles. So Murali also works on the Fair Work project and is a member of the team, and he manages the country studies that they do in Bangladesh, Pakistan, South Africa, and Jordan. He was a faculty fellow at Data and Society, where his work focused on reimagining communication and technology studies from anti-caste perspectives, which will soon be available online. And he since developed a module on critical caste and technology studies. Murali is a prolific author and has written about pro-poor access to communication technologies, internet governance, access to knowledge, caste and development, caste hate speech, and most recently, the critical caste and technology studies syllabus. So today, Murali will be giving us an introduction to critical caste and technology studies. So without further ado, let me hand over to him. Welcome, Murali. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'd just like to thank everyone for taking the time to come in, because I see that to participate in a discussion, a topic like this, it's just not a participation. I see that as a kind of a political solidarity as well. So I thank you for that solidarity, and it's very important to acknowledge that. I've got quite a big task in front of me. But what I'm going to do, I plan to wrap it up in 30 to 35 minutes and open up for discussion so we can have more sort of interactive chat. So, what's happening?
Okay.
This always happens, doesn't it?
It's quite an image, actually.
I lost it. Can someone, Emma?
Right.
Sorry about that.
No, it's what your fault. I didn't realize it was showing.
A glitch has to happen at some point of the talk.
Exactly, yeah.
Actually, it shows it in notes form. I don't think, is it showing on Zoom in notes form? Yeah. Okay. So my induction week experience I might know how to fix this.
Oh, please.
If not, do you want to grab our photos? We definitely go.
I just want to go downstairs.
Stop share. Do you have notes? Do you want to present to you? It was certainly Q&A. Yeah. Okay, so if it stops, sometimes I need to like stop. So you didn't actually click and then it's just like a break.
Right. Back.
Okay.
Yeah. So, as you know, that the talk title today is the critical cost of technology studies. people always ask me why this topic now. My answer is why it's not been happening until now. That's the answer to it, very short answer to it. But my 30 minutes, I'll be expanding that answer. That's what I'm telling about what are the things that one should be paying attention to. So let me start with a very brief introduction of caste. And there is no single way to introduce caste system, because sociologists have a particular way of introducing caste system, political scientists, anthropologists, and essentialists and non-essentialists, they all have different ways to describe caste system. So what I'm going to do is that carefully put together my words, looking at from communication studies and digital cultures perspective. It kind of leads up to that. So caste determines social hierarchy and divisions of labor and restricts people's access to fundamental rights. So endogamy, which is a practice marriage only within the same caste group, is a precondition of caste system. And caste produces social, political, and economic dispossession and the denial of opportunities wherever the practice is prevalent in South Asian countries as well as the global diaspora. Therefore, caste cannot ensure social justice, equality, fellowships, fraternity, and fairness. And that's the basic point, because what we hear these days, how caste can actually affirms or reproduces community feeling. And caste is not a community. That is something that we should bear in mind. Caste is an artificial category designed to actually create hierarchies. So it cannot be community. But loosely, even sometimes anti-caste scholars conflate these two terms, caste and community, which is not. And these words, these articulations are extremely important. And that is one of the reasons why I think caste should be approached from communicative practices point of view. The most inferiorized category of people, a collection of various jati and caste, the groups, they came to be termed as formally untouchables, and they were self-identified as Dalits. And people normally say Dalits as only untouchables, but I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit more about it. The Dalit leader Baba Sahib Ambedkar also acknowledged there are two other further classes, he quote, classes of extreme inferiorization. And this might actually shock some of you. So there were unapproachables, one particular group. And these unapproachables, those who they can cause pollution from a distance, just by the sight. And then you have another category called unseeable. And unseeable are not allowed to be seen during the day because their line of sight can cause pollution. So Dalit is a political category. Again, it's not a caste group, not a caste. People often again use Dalit as a kind of an interchangeable word to refer caste. Dalits, I'm a Dalit caste, he's a Dalit caste. No, Dalit is not a caste name. Dalit is a political category. So Dalit is a political category of most oppressed caste groups comprising formally untouchables, unapproachables, and unseeables. Here's another, just I take a pause and I want to talk about one more thing about caste system. As I mentioned that each discipline has a particular way of actually looking at caste. From communication studies point of view and digital culture studies point of view, I adopt a non-essentialist approach. So what do I mean by that? Because caste is generally associated with Hinduism. And it is true, caste had a huge footprint within the Hinduism framework, but it's not exclusive to Hinduism. Caste can also exist in other religious groups as well, or other communities as well. So especially in South Asia, and also now that people have moved to Europe and to the US, you will see caste system existing, pervading in other parts as well. For those who don't know, in this country, I think about 10 years ago, the Equality Act recognized caste as a social protected category. However, much to my surprise, if you look at any diversity and inclusion statement of research institute, universities, there's no mention of caste. Just throwing it out. So those who benefit mostly from inequities of the globalized caste system, that means caste can also afford opportunities depending on one's rank. They argue that in the modern world, through its embrace of social networks, capital technology, they have effectively become casteless. And they also argue disruption of digital networks are putting the question of caste oppression to rest, a relic of older times. Now, critical caste and technology studies discards the veneer of a casteless modern India and South Asian diaspora, and argues that it's an ideological myth that enables Brahmanism, coloniality, and tech-driven global tech capitalism in much the same way post-racial rhetoric props up racism and racial capitalism. And also decades of locally rooted anti-caste activism in the UK and US, as well as casteist experiences in certain African countries, demand the need for critical global caste studies and theory, akin to critical race theory. Right? As I said, in this country, it's been recognized in the Equality Act, even though after that they conducted a very unfair consultation in which they decided to repeal, but they haven't done it yet. We don't know when that will happen. So as part of the anti-caste stakeholder group, as a member, I am there, we find it extremely difficult to actually push that agenda because we have a lot of UK-based casteist lobby happening to prevent from that happening. Now, this is where critical caste and technology studies comes in as a new attempt to organize the field of anti-caste scholarship around the fundamental consideration of communicative practices. Now, when we talk about caste-related oppression and humiliation and subordination, we often actually talk in terms of negative terms, victimhood often, actually, that's a framework. But what I'd like to actually invite you to look at, caste pride, on the other hand, is often when it goes unnoticed. And when it goes unnoticed, it actually perpetuates caste-related harms. So in many ways, if viewed from communication studies point of view, caste pride is the source of caste violence, right? So here is a very intriguing example, because secular institutions, modernists, all public intellectuals from so-called India studies, they all say that caste is changing, it's kind of we are becoming casteless and so on and so forth. Now here's an example. So in 2007, Amartya Sen gave a speech to the Trade Association of Indian IT and Business Processing Association, it's called NASCOM, where he explained India's IT success through its historical respect for distinctive skills. And he quoted, caste may have lots of evil features, qualities, but it also actually offered a specialization of skills. Now that's actually coming from a man who's well-respected, developed economist, and cared so much for justice and equality. And he also romanticized caste system. So that's the romanticization, and caste pride is very, very at the source of caste violence. In some ways, people often argue that caste violence no longer, it's kind of fading, therefore there's no caste system, but caste pride is increasing. If you look at, a few years ago in this country, the Prospect magazine ran a story in which they attributed India's IT success to the pedagogic and intellectual traditions rooted in Sanskritic Vedas. You see, there you go. That's a sort of a caste pride. So why should we, going back to this question, why should we be viewed as, caste should be viewed as a communicative practice, and why this lens is especially important at the moment? Because I argue that caste is constitutive of and constituted by social communication that encompasses cultural, political, economic, and development aspects of society in all caste-affected societies. Caste can be either the pervasive glue or the rupture, depending on one's caste rank-based perspective, without which social interaction is incomplete in any caste-affected societies. And therefore, caste is the kind of so people often actually argue that caste is a very rigid system. Caste is very rigid, that's why it is sustained. But if you look at it from communication and cultural studies point of view, caste is so adaptive and fluid. That is why it's able to remanifest itself constantly over a period of, God knows, 2,000 years or so, right? So what I'm trying to say is that how certain fixed perspectives can be problematized about caste system, notions of caste system, theories of caste system, when looking from communication, cultural, and digital cultures point of view. In fact, there's a very interesting quote by Karl Marx, who famously observed that India's caste system will eventually fade once road infrastructure, telecoms, and technologies comes to exist. And what has happened is just the opposite of it. So you can see that, how caste can be very adaptive, very nuanced. It doesn't have to necessarily manifest all the time through extreme violence, but it can unsettle someone through a simple question. That's what it is. So in order to understand that, a communicative approach is a critical ways of actually looking at caste system, which is more suited to present day's caste realities than other influential cultural, ideological, social, structural approaches. So that's the reason why I'd like to look at caste from everyday communicative practices point of view. For example, if you look at online matrimonial sites, caste exclusive online spaces, casteist trolls, these are all everyday. This is where caste actually lives these days in cosmopolitan pockets. Very briefly, the globalization of caste. So there's a saying, people often say, what Ambedkar say, people often quote Ambedkar, wherever Hindus go, emigrate, they always take the caste system with them. So, but it's not only Hindus, I must say, I must include other people as well. So you have Dalit Christians now, and you have Dalit Muslims. So that also gets actually taxonomized outside South Asia, right? We are seeing recent examples in the US, much so buried under the carpet in this country, but more in the US, tech companies, caste practices in tech companies. We will talk more about it, but for now, I'm just saying that, people are being outed. So the outing is a very interesting term. So you don't actually discriminate anybody, but, kind of exclusive room or club or association or wherever you are, you simply out someone. That's it. Oh, you know who he is. That's enough. And that cannot come under any criminal behavior or whatsoever. And this is why we need a caste-sensitive approach. And all social media platforms have exclusive caste spaces, and which is something you cannot have. You cannot say you cannot have a racist space. I mean, people do have, but if it comes to social media platforms' attention, they are obliged to actually act upon it. But when it comes to caste, in this country, for example, you have a North London Brahmin Society, an organization, and they have a Facebook group. And if you want to join the Facebook group, they have certain questions, and those questions actually reveal whether you are a Brahmin or not. So I'm rushing, but that's partly because, I don't want to, we could talk endlessly, but we have I need to move to the research agenda. So what is that critical caste and technology studies? What can it offer to the critical internet studies as a discipline? And what are the things that we should be looking for, right? The first, I want to start with legacy media studies. So if you look at media studies, especially from race and gender sexuality point of view, one of the common framework is diversity and representation. They often say, how many women are represented at various levels or different gender people and so on and so forth, which is very important. But I'd like to give you two examples and argue that, especially looking at from communication cultural studies point of view, and then argue that why that is not enough. So during one of my research was actually focused on how media, couple of English media, national English media, newspapers, how they are actually looking at caste, how they were actually talking about caste. So I actually adopted this very conventional method of looking at analysis, content analysis, discourse analysis, and so on. Then suddenly one day I realized these are orchestrated spaces. But what I should be looking at, there are very exclusive spaces produced by media owners every day in their newspapers, and they only have a say to do what to publish in that. So, for example, I took two spaces to analyze. One is today's engagements. So today's engagements is actually what happens in Indian newspapers, that if you're actually organizing a function, event, program, you write that event or send a PR note to the editorial. The editorial will receive all the notes and they choose to publish what they want to publish. In many ways, this research and analysis happened in Chennai newspapers. So in many ways, Chennai is being curated by media owners culturally. And you can only see that when you look at non-news content spaces. So when you look at the opinion pieces, other things, it may look very radical, very, very progressive, but that's kind of actually pandering to the needs of our PCness. But then the media want to have a very implicit, very, sort of a relationship with their readers, and they know what language they have to talk about. And there's another column in Indian newspapers, which is quite odd. It's called faith column, religion column. So every day, the editorial decides to publish a religious quote in that column. And the newspapers that I've actually examined, they both published only Sanskritic Brahminical quotes, nothing else. So these two non-news content spaces reveal the real color and that attempt to bond with their own readership quarters. So this is why I argue that a sheer content analysis, discourse analysis can only take thus far, but we need a structural reformation. So a journalist can be very cost sensitive, but the editor, the owner, can actually kill that story. So we need to kind of a completely reform. We need to look at radical structures. In the same way, we have lots of online newspapers these days, digital magazines. And it is very interesting to see the contents are looking very progressive, but the way they archive those contents are extremely costist. They would, regardless of the content, even if it's a story of empowerment, challenge, resistance, it's always Dalits, Dalit violence, that's the kind of archival. So the digital knowledge ecosystem is actually built around victimhood, not around resistance movement, if you know what I mean. And another thing is that communicative practices unsettles or problematize concepts in communication technology studies. I'll give you two examples. If every time I hear the word Global South, forgive me for saying this, I know it's a very popular term, it just unsettles me because I don't relate with that term. Because Global South is a very monolithic, disruptive word. It actually represents in many ways caste elites who have the opportunity to be there somewhere and articulate. But from anti-caste oppressed emancipatory politics point of view, I would rather actually use to specify actual groups. We don't need to actually meta them all the time. The attempt to meta actually kills the nuances of degradation and nuances of inequality, graded inequality. And also, if you look at privacy, privacy is now completely mediated through in technological terms, theories, and concepts, for reasons we all know. But privacy to a Dalit doesn't exist, period. He is completely ostracized, his space is robbed, and there's no articulation of that. So you may give him mobile phone. In one of my work, I found mobile phones were used to create a safety insular network, not to expand and interact with the rest of the others, because dominant caste people don't even take oppressed caste people's phone calls. It's very interesting. I have an anecdote about it, but maybe I will reserve it for later. So in the sense, so what I'm trying to argue is that communication technology studies, concepts and theories can be radically problematized and evolved if you use anti-caste perspective. And this is a very common one. Everyone knows that. I'm not going to spend more time on it. Absence of caste agenda in most universities, research institutes, and other places not only in the West, but also in South Asia as well. I think it's about time to consider that caste as a kind of a typography, a communication typology, a social and political typology when talking about critical internet studies, because it affects the fifth of the world's population. Yet, we hardly talk about it and discuss that. Now, the other research agenda I would propose is that, if you look at the content moderation, the amount of money that tech platforms are investing are quite huge. Now, I'm going to contrast that with something else. So we have almost if you look at the entire population that can be associated with one caste group or other, we are talking about something like 1.5 to 1.75 billion in the world, right? And I should name them, yeah. So if you look at Twitter India, right, they have no content moderators in India. And if you look at Facebook, they have some moderators, but those moderators actually come from privileged caste background and entrepreneurs. So there's an active need to be, sensitize tech corporations to look into content moderation. What kind of content moderation should be doing, and how do they kind of, crowdsourcing content moderation? Because caste system is vast in different languages, different nuances. So universities and research institutes can play a huge role in those sort of areas by working closely with tech platforms. And that's not yet happened. That needs to happen. Oh, and yeah, this is so one of the things that I'd like to point out in the West is that John Rawls' theory of justice is extremely used when building fairness, when you talk about fairness principles into machine learning. And it's a very commonly acknowledged one because it actually focuses on fairness. It actually talks about distributive justice. It talks about everyone should be treated the same way. Now, if you look at that from an anti-caste perspective, those sort of principles are very unhelpful. I'll give you an example. So when I was doing this work on caste hate speech, I spoke to a lot of feminists who belong to Dalit caste groups. And most tech platforms have this guideline. If you want to be verified, you have to appear on your original name, and you have to put your picture in the profile, and so on and so on, because authenticity. And every time some of these women actually did it, their lives were actually put in danger. So they went back to Twitter and they went back to Facebook. This is not acceptable. Could you please change those sort of guidelines? It's very cost insensitive. They said no. So, and they actually pointed out that this is the kind of a fairness principle that we follow, and that's based on Rawls' theory of justice. And then we have Ambedkar's theory of justice, which is much more radical. So how do we actually measure that? So we need a kind of a systematic theoretical change in principle and belief when building this architecture. And that's only possible when you look at from anti-caste perspective. And finally, cost and platform. This is very interesting manifestation of cost system in platform economy. Recently, during the pandemic, in India, there's a company, I think urban company, they announced the services, sending barbers, this is the word they used, sending barbers and laundress, or dobies they call it, in local parlance. They said they offered these platform workers, barbers as platform workers and dobies as platform workers. Now, barbers and dobies traditionally belong to a very inferiorized caste. And for a very long time, they went home, they went to these dominant caste people and served this, serviced them. And over a period of time, they protested, they set up their own places, shop, they demanded people to come so that it can be treated as a business. Now, during the pandemic, this position is reversed, role is reversed. When the role began to reverse, caste system immediately kicked in. So when the barber actually went to provide a service, he will have to, adhere to certain principles. He can't walk into the main door. He has to walk. So he was not actually, he was deprofessionalized in many ways. And remanifestation of caste system is rife, especially in India and other places as well. So there is a need to kind of look at these sort of disruptive technologies. Who's being disrupted? By whom? That's the question, right? Whose life's being disrupted? Whose dignity is being disrupted? And those sort of questions can be asked only if you view from anti-caste perspective. Finally, just a promo. That's the syllabus. Okay, so if you want to have a look at it, you can look at it and email me. The reason why I'm doing this piece of talk is that it's an appeal to everybody and also to OII to consider critical cost and technology studies kind of a discipline. And I would welcome those sort of discussion and engagement. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was really interesting, and yeah, a lot of food for thought. I think now, if it's okay, we're going to move to questions in the room and questions online. So immediately, actually, we have a question from someone online. They say, "Hello, my name is Aswita. I'm a PhD candidate. Can you talk through a bit more on how you differentiate caste and community? The word community seems to have come to replace the word caste, or act as its proxy rather, in everyday speak, at least in Tamil Nadu. What community is she from versus what caste is she? I'd also love to hear your thoughts on the shying away from using the word caste in general conversation."
What's the second question?
Love to hear your thoughts on shying away from using the word caste in general conversation.
Yeah, okay. I mean, as I said, caste is a very divisive term, but sociologically, we all agree that community is a sort of a term that actually brings people together, which is why they can't go together, you know. So it's very simple to me. I don't see any problem in differentiating that. And the reason is why caste is being what I would call communitized, because they wanted to actually give some legitimacy to caste groups. And they wanted to sort of sanitize, and they wanted us to look at caste as a kind of a organic social group, which is not true. So that's the case. I mean, shying away from caste, I think I have a, I think anyone can talk about caste. Anyone has the right to disclose one's caste. Forced identity, that's what I would call. I wouldn't call it caste identity. So what's been forced upon this person, and it's the person's individual choice. Asking is insensitive. Asking is the same as outing. Asking is also normalizing caste as an organic social category. So there's no need for that. You can discuss the issues without having to introduce one's caste in public space. You can introduce yourself by, I'm an anti-caste human being. That's just about it.
Thank you. A couple more questions online, maybe. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Would you like to ask a question? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sanj, and I'm doing a master's here in the social sciences of the internet. And I have a question related to so online dating sites, and I mean, I see that increasingly on sites like Bumble and Tinder, like you cannot enter your caste. You can also, I mean, it's your wish if you want to enter your caste if you want, but I don't think so. They ask you for your caste as a requirement. And secondly, like you can also choose to not show your full name. So like usually in India, our full names are a marker of our caste as well, but you can choose to not show your full name if you want to and just keep the first initial of your letter and the other things anonymous. So I would love to hear your views about this. Like, do you think this is a step towards an anti-caste society, or do you think this could lead to other matrimonial sites coming up that would connect people on the basis of caste and create those as categories of connection?
I mean, it's very interesting development since Shadi.com's PR disaster. However, I think the trend continues because I find that company pushing the onus of responsibility to the consumer side is a bit dangerous. They don't do that when it comes to race. Do you want to declare yourself racist or not? That's your choice. No, that's not how it works. We don't allow the thing to happen on our platform. That's the kind of a active moderation that needs to happen. And I haven't seen that happen yet. So that's where we should be pushing. And that calls for, again, the Rawls just theory of justice. You know, if customer, that's what Shadi.com argued. Shadi.com, when they were questioned, they said, it's the fairness principle that we all build our internet on. We give consumers the opportunity and consumers actually define what they want. It's not I'm encouraging that filter. It's the consumer's preference. No, that's not possible. I mean, that shouldn't happen.
Sorry.
Something to in follow with this.
Yeah.
May I ask?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, that's a very interesting thing you pointed out. So, but yeah, like but how this concept of asking for one's race, like it also exists in several places. Like when we applied for the universities in UK, there was a section to mention our race, like Asian, British, and all of that. So if an Indian university does it in terms of caste, it would be considered casteist. Whereas if it is being done in terms of race, like what is your take on it? Is it justified or?
I don't think anyone calls it casteist when Indian universities do. I have a problem
But
that
no,
let me
kind of.
yeah. My problem is actually so there are two ways of actually asking not one's identity, but asking to share one's social index in private. So when you share that index, like for a long time, people, they didn't want to reveal their sexuality and they shared in private. Our institutions had different ways of asking, but they used it in private to respect and allow dignity to, that's the reason. The purpose of collecting those data is to actually ensure representation and make sure you have good policies in place. So that's the point of it. So I don't see asking one's social index is problematic as long as privacy is actually maintained and dignity is assured and used only for the purposes it's intended to collect.
We have a lot of questions online. Someone.
No, take some online.
Yeah, I'll come back. Yeah. Someone doing default law says exclusion by upper caste students of Dalit students here at Oxford and elsewhere happens in informal, subtle and hidden ways. As you have mentioned, the caste cultural expresses in ways which makes it difficult to be directly addressed through anti-discrimination rules. How do we make such behavior accountable institutionally? Well,
I know which one this person is talking about. There's recently an article published in Untouchables India. Yes. I think this is where we demand, not only just in Oxford University, but also in the UK as well, that caste should be recognized as a criminal category. And therefore, once that's recognized, there should be policies and processes in place. At the moment, if a shopkeeper, Indian shopkeeper or casteist shopkeeper harasses his or her employee on the basis of caste, this country does not have the policies in place to actually protect the victim. So what we demand is that we need to have this conversation out, and we need to have this in our policies explicitly and train people how caste is actually manifested in everyday practices so that people become aware of it, like any other social category.
Yeah. Sorry. A question from
Sorry. Thank you so much for this lecture. And you started it with saying that coming here is also like political solidarity. And I must say that just being here, hearing lecture from you and being attended by a lot of my anti-caste colleagues, it's also an emotional moment. So thank you for this.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for everyone. You mentioned caste as a communicative practice. Thinking of caste as a communicative practice has been important to this field of study. Is this also moving away from thinking of caste as a religious, doctrine? Or like I work on caste in Muslims, so many things. The fact that the Vedas are not important. The dictums. There is a disjunct between what we think of as caste essentially, and this. So I'm interested in your views.
I think, as I said, I adopt a non-essentialist approach. So I recognize there's a very strong relationship between Manu, Sanatana Dharma, and Hindutva. And that's been articulated currently in Indian and even here and the US, diasporic ecosystem. It's manifested as a sort of a caste pride practice, as a Hindu pride practice. So this is why I said pride is actually very important to, we need to unproblematize that term. So I think caste is actually, can be actually sometimes where appropriate, can be articulated in religious framework and so on. But I do feel that caste should be looked at beyond religion. And I do feel that how caste is actually, how human beings, casteist human being articulate and express us on an everyday practice. That's where I'm most concerned. The articulation is my key point. Yeah,
right.
Not
as pride.
Not only pride. You can easily humiliate someone. So you can say, my dad is an IAS cadre, civil servant, and are you on a scholarship? Are you on a loan?
Yeah.
So there are different ways. So it doesn't have to be explicitly caste, right? Yeah. There are markers. That's why communicative practices are very helpful in in kind of disarming this
Yeah.
discuss. Yeah.
Thank you. So I just want to say to everyone that we have almost 100 participants online. So I am really trying to get the questions in from online as well. So someone says, hello, my name is Kumar and I'm a journalist based in New Delhi. We've seen traditionally political parties have targeted voters on the basis of caste. In fact, political parties have been formed on the basis of caste. Now technologies provide very sophisticated ways of micro-targeting voters, and parties collect voters' caste data through pervasive ways. Do you think technology has changed the way caste is used in electoral democracy?
I think it's both ways, but I'm tempted to argue that how caste is actually so adaptive and trying to use all sorts of platforms to negotiate and remanifest their presence. That's what is happening. So it's not just actually technology is actually waiting for the casters to come in, but also how these people actually, Facebook never was meant to exist to create caste solidarity platform, but people found that platform and latched onto it. So it's a question of actually, it goes both ways. That's my answer. Yeah.
Sorry, I see that someone there has been looking to ask a question for, yeah. Yes.
My persistences. Hi, Debbie, my name is Nikita. I work on caste tech and policing in India, and of course agree with Shireen that we're all here in solidarity, and thank you for the wonderful talk. My question, I have two questions. One is, of course, the work that I do is with communities, particularly known as the denotified tribes in India, who are classified as criminals by birth through a colonial legislation known as the Criminal Tribes Act. Which leads to my first question is, one, how do we see the sort of heterogeneity within oppressed caste groups and their own sort of specific histories, whether it's in terms of Pasmanda Muslims or the denotified tribes. So how do we see that heterogeneity manifest when it comes to technology? And secondly, because my work is with policing, to sort of understand, if you have any thoughts about how technology is manifesting in terms of the way that the criminal justice system is doing this, because, particularly during the pandemic, there has been a sort of a greater push to say, we need to digitize so-called criminal databases and use AI for policing. So too, the heterogeneity within oppressed caste groups interacting with technology, and more specifically, if you have any thoughts about how this manifests within the realm of policing and the criminal justice system. Thank you.
I think the heterogeneity within oppressed caste group, one should be mindful of two ways of articulating emancipatory politics. One is as a political mobilization. That's where you have a group solidarity comes to play a really, really important role, like Dalit as a caste group. But then you also have, looking at very importantly, looking at very few caste groups who are extremely marginalized. And one of the things that, for example, the example that I can think of from Tamil Nadu is that, they have this very, what we call it, it's a very bad expression, but that's what they call it. It's called inner reservation. So yeah. So you kind of actually look at, so there is an argument about creamy layer. Creamy layer is actually, people always say, we don't want to extend affirmative action to Dalit and oppressed caste group any longer because they've become very rich and economically well off, blah, blah, blah. So they're called a creamy layer, so they should be taken off. So instead of that creamy layer argument, we should reverse that argument to approach heterogeneity within oppressed caste group. And that argument is yet to happen in many parts of India and other caste-affected societies. So that's one thing. So that discussion needs to happen. The second point about digitization, I think this whole digitization is done in a very euphoric manner. I think one needs to have again, as I said in my talk, one needs to adopt an anti-caste sensitive principles when talking about it. A very good example is that most electronic governance schemes in India, papers have been written now, tend to benefit only dominant caste landholders and not oppressed caste landless laborers. So we have to kind of rethink of all this from caste sense in the same way that we, in other places, people think of policies from gender perspective, racial perspective. That's what needs to happen. So I think the whole digitization is actually, it's like a bulldozed, and I'm not a big fan of what's happening, and it lacks caste sensitivity.
Thank you. Someone online says, I was wondering if you could expand more on the Rawls theory of justice versus Ambedkar's theory of justice, which you mentioned, especially how the former is used in machine learning contexts and about the latter's potential.
That's going to be another talk.
Great. That's a good way to get rid of some of these questions. Maybe a different, okay, so that person maybe come back for a different talk then. Sorry, then a different question online. I understand when you said that employing the term Global South tends to actively conflate varied classes, status groups, and their experiences into one. But apart from caste elites or local elites in other parts of what forms the Global South, should we completely discard the concept? What about the historical oppression and exclusion that links these territories?
So if we're, let's say, if you're talking about a particular group of people, particular type of particular territory, just name them. That's my thinking. You don't have to say, you know, what's happening in India, and then you refer, this is what's happening in Global South. You don't need that introduction. So we need to be specific about groups and categories, and then we can be sensitive about it. That's my simple way forward. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. But my question is like, in Indian context, I mean, in this total South Asian context, coloniality played a role, of course, in the social and cultural atmosphere. So do you think it's this caste system and then coloniality is like a mutually exclusive, or like they have some sort of interaction? Or I know it's broad question.
No.
You're having insights on that.
I get this question all the time. Yeah. See, coloniality and post-coloniality is often actually articulated and theorized in a very teleological manner, pre and post. But from an emancipatory politics cost perspective, there is no pre and post. It's been in a continuum, which is why I have problem in the term called decolonization. I don't use the word post-coloniality, but I think I prefer anti-coloniality, because anti-coloniality can be something that can happen from within and outside. So it's not like actually there is no geographical, racial, empire-oriented marked line. And if you look at the Indian independence movement, critical writings have been written, and it's always a Hindu freedom movement, right? And subaltern studies, if you look at it, for a long time, the criticism is that it's extremely oriented towards caste insensitivity. So, yeah.
Sorry, Vicky, yeah.
Some questions to go first. This is super interesting, and it is educational, I think, for a lot of us in its own right. So I'm really grateful to you for taking the first time up to do this today. Being the OII, I was curious to know if you could just say a little bit more about the way in which things like social media operationalize caste. And in particular, you made a lot of mention, obviously, of rules, and the whole point about rules in theory is it should apply only to ideal situations, not situations written with inequality. So how far do things like social media, as far as you understand it, through algorithmic practice, through categorization, if you like, sort of, embed, reinforce caste inequality and injustice? Could you say a bit more about that?
Okay, so just one quick example, right? I mean, we can talk later about this. Yeah. Let's take the word pariah, right? So until pre-digital period, the word pariah was used as there was a loose canonization of the word by Max Weber, Hannah Arendt, and they also conflated race and caste together. And it was problematic. But it kind of happened in silos, because there was no digital networks to move things around. Now, what's happening now? The word pariah is actually, when you're writing about hate speech or filters and algorithm, it actually gives it, people have given it a free pass. It's not considered to be a bad word at all. Whereas where I come from, in most caste-affected societies, call someone pariah, then you're in big trouble. But because of the Western loose canonization of word pariah, now it is actually being legitimized and sanitized in digital platforms across in all places. And as a result, and a casteist user can freely use this word and can get away with any of it, no punishment whatsoever. So there are more examples of that kind.
That's so interesting. We're going to have to try this conversation.
Sorry, question from online. You introduced caste as a globalized phenomenon. Is it a phenomenon globalized because of the migration for work for studies of Indian societies elsewhere? Do you contend the proposition that the caste system existing in Silicon Valley is among the Indian people there?
Yeah, I started by saying wherever these guys migrate, they take Hindu and caste system in their bags and suitcases. It's one of the essential ingredients. So that's how it actually, but not just actually now. So okay, here is a nuanced point about it. So until 1970s, except in African countries, especially in South Africa, but that's again another lecture for another talk. So if you look at what's happening in the US and mostly in the UK as well, until 1960s or 70s, the people who migrated largely belonged to relatively dominant caste groups. So there was an implicit consensus about who they were. So there was the castelessness emanated from caste identity, right? Whereas the 70s onwards, especially in post-80s and also in post-globalization, there's a mass migration of oppressed caste groups, Dalits, and so on. So when they went and actually mixed with this casteless, caste-blind dominant diaspora, there it became a problem. That's what's happening in this valley.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I think it's actually the man behind you. I was sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. Just two quick questions. I think firstly, I think you spoke something about meta-narratives and how it sort of takes us away from certain forms of oppression, specific forms of oppression. But it also sort of got me thinking about if there is a potential danger of using or seeing caste as one meta-narrative. And how can we sort of try and tackle that once we start analyzing things through caste? I mean, the reason why I'm asking that is because when we juxtapose caste with, say, technology, which is, we can see that as the ultimate form of manifestation of compression of space and time. It's global in nature. So how does the local and the regional dimensions of caste oppression sort of fit in that global technology idea?
Yeah.
And the second question, if I may ask, or maybe that's a different question, but
let me ask this here.
Yeah.
I think I meant meta-narrative in the sense the tech platforms, especially when building architects on an algorithm, they should be able to figure out what are the nuances. That's why I use the word crowdsourcing casteless, which is very important. But when you're crowdsourcing caste slurs, they are caste slurs, right? So they are different type of slurs, attacking different types of groups, but they are coming under caste. So we have to have this casteist as a generic meta filter. And that's going to that's the sort of a meta that I would like to actually see tech companies are doing. But you cannot just have a meta in the vacuum. It just has to have lots of strands, which is why crowdsourcing is very important. Because otherwise, tech companies can do, but they're not doing it.
Yeah. And just quickly another.
I'm so sorry. I think we only have time for one more question. So, but yes, and in that, yeah, thank you. Would you like to ask your question? Yeah.
So my question was with regards to content moderation. As you just used the example of Paraya, there are other words like, reservation, which is frequently used in the online discourse. And that's a word which is used both by anti-caste activists as well as, caste people who are against reservation. And most of the times, anti-caste scholars or activists are actually humiliated for using reservation. And while reservation is just, policy or an affirmative action, it is not really a casteist abuse. So how do we tackle the challenges of content moderation in such a context?
I think this is already happening in the race field. So when there are two Afro-American actually speak, and if they use slurs against each other, the algorithm doesn't pick up. When it's actually used between in an interracial conversation, then it raises a red flag. So you can fine tune the content. This is why content moderation is also contextual moderation, right? And this is why you need local people to actually do that. At the moment, most of the Twitter content moderation is happening in Philippines and Singapore. For South Asia purposes, I'm saying, yeah.
And thanks a lot for this talk. And again, as Nikita and Shri mentioned, we're in solidarity.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I think Emma's going to come down, but I just want to say that at one point we had like 99 people online and a lot of people in this room, which is incredibly good. And I think a really respectful and enthusiastic conversation. So thank you so much. If we can. would you like to tell people how to find you? Like, so if you would like anyone to ask you questions outside of this session.
Yeah, well, our event website has my profile, so that's the best way to reach me. Yeah,
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
thank you for
and-
doing this wonderful job.
She wasn't. Thank you so much, MC. Thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you so much.
Great. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to have a look at how many questions